It's funny. We, as I mentioned, wrote this paper, which then became the book called God and Money, named after the class we took. We wrote that while we were in grad school, both of us with extensive student loan debt, negative net worth, basically. And so John and I often joke that it is one thing to sit in our ivory tower in Cambridge, Massachusetts, writing about what we will one day do with money that we don't yet have. And it's another thing to put it into practice. So to share a bit of my personal story related to that, upon graduating from my MBA program, my wife and I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, which is where I live now. And I joined a small healthcare startup there. And just 6 weeks after I joined the startup, it sold to a much larger healthcare company for over $400 million. And I was fortunate to be a small equity holder in the startup. And so I received a payout that I often joke was infinity times my net worth, which was negative at the time, just 6 weeks after graduating. And I think that happening can be accurately described as a test from God to see if I really would put into practice the lessons that he so graciously taught me while I was in this divinity school course. And I have a few observations from that experience. The first is that it is so helpful to have done the work in advance around the finish line concept, because then when the money comes, it was actually relatively straightforward to allocate it across the categories of spending, saving, and giving in a way that we had in advance prayed through, talked about as a couple, shared with other Christian friends, and so therefore felt like was faithful. Second, though, is even having financial finish lines does not somehow eliminate all temptation relative to money. I would argue that for many people, probably not everyone, but for many people, money is one of the top one or two major drivers of temptation in our lives. Pride's probably first for pretty much everybody, but money is like right up there. And we experienced that. Well, I'll give you one specific example. Shortly after moving to Nashville, we realized that we needed a second family car because we had lived in like major urban centers for a long time prior to moving to Nashville. We had one family car, which was fine if you live in downtown Boston, less fine if you live in the suburbs of Nashville. So, we needed a second car. And I was looking at, cool cars, nothing, too luxurious, I'll say, but I was certain that an Acura was in the center of God's will for my life following this transaction that I mentioned before. And, I'd talked to Allison, my wife, about it. And thankfully she's much more faithful than I am. And she kind of looked at me and said, like, do we really need to spend that much on a car? And, after I got done pouting, I acknowledged, no, we don't. And I realized that my grandmother had a 2002 Mercury Grand Marquis sitting in her garage that she had not driven for like 5 years due to health reasons. She was not able to. And so, I went home to Mama's house, put some money into the car, a new battery, new tires, cleaned it up. And that's what I drove for the next 5 years. And I raised that to say this money did bring temptation despite having finish lines. And that car, that Grand Marquis, stood as a daily reminder for me that my value is not in my stuff, which is a reminder that I needed. And then the final lesson I'll offer relative to stewarding the funds from that initial sale of the business that I mentioned is I realized that being generous is not a choice that we make just one time, but rather is a choice that we make daily in gratitude to Christ for his generosity toward us. And what I mean by that is connecting this concept of financial stewardship to growing closer to Christ and becoming more Christ-like. God really used the generosity that we were able to do with that money to teach us, hey, Greg and Allison, this is actually not about the giving. I don't need your money. I'm a sovereign God. I'll accomplish my purposes with or without you. But this money is one tool that I have given you as humans to grow closer to me, participate in my kingdom work, and become more like me. And we heard God teaching us that lesson during that period of time. So those would be three of the main lessons that we learned from that.